Welcome to the Get Real About Safety podcast. In our podcast, we discuss the new view of safety, what works and what doesn't work, to break down old paradigms and help you improve safety performance in your organization. Hi, I'm Mike.
And I'm Pam, and we appreciate you listening. Please share and subscribe and tell others about this podcast. You can find us on most podcast platforms and also on YouTube. All right. Well, good morning, Mike.
Morning, Pam. How are we?
We're doing good, and it's been a journey with your knee surgery, but it is now finally getting to the point that it's on the up and up, and you're starting to move around pretty darn good. So
it is. Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
Yes.
You and I have had kind of a unique careers and somewhat parallel in some ways, but we often talk about how things have changed, and we've had the opportunity to see tremendous change in our careers. So we got to thinking about doing this podcast to talk about the way things were and the way things are going.
Yeah.
So this may very well be a 2 or even 3-parter talking about the way things were to start out.
Things definitely have changed over the years.
There's been dramatic change, and it's exciting. It's really exciting to be able to see that change that seemed pretty stagnant for a number of years, but has picked up and moved dramatically in a good way. You want to start out for us and talk a little bit about how you got into safety and how you got where you are?
Yeah, I was a medic in the military, and then I got out of that and became a paramedic. I was one of the first classes of advanced EMT paramedics, and then moved from there after a number of years into safety, and started my safety career out in the nuclear construction industry, working for Georgia Power Company. The group that I was with then is now called Southern Nuclear. But this was back during the construction, the plant Vogel units 1 and 2 back in the late 70s and early 80s. And, that just as an aside from that, in context of what we're talking about here, this was only a few years after OSHA even came into being. So this is just past the days of riding headache balls.
And then you moved from that on to working for a large general contractor, correct?
Yeah, I moved from that into bridge and highway construction,
Right.
Working for a large general contractor, moved from that into the insurance industry where we met.
That's right.
And then some 20-something years ago, we started ProSafe Solutions.
Yes, we did.
So we've been around a while.
Yeah, that's right. And our careers were strangely parallel, even though I'm from the Pacific Northwest, and I went to school to be a nurse. I became a registered nurse and thought I would take a more traditional nursing path, but my family on my dad's side's history has been construction for, great-great-grandfather as far back as I can trace it. So construction's in my blood. And I ended up, I had EMT training prior to nursing school and was living out in a very remote county in eastern Washington, about 65 miles from Hanford nuclear site. And so I ended up getting hired as an RN on Hanford 2, and then ultimately getting the opportunity to move into safety for a large general contractor. And that was quite a change, quite a shocking change, actually. When I was working as a nurse, after some initial bumps and so forth, we had the support of the workers tremendously, and they really thought highly of us and treated us well and brought us candies, and they really appreciated, because we were on a project that was very isolated, and we were it for them if they got hurt. Then when I went into safety, lo and behold, everybody hated me all of a sudden, changed hard hats, and now I was hated not only by the workforce, but by my fellow safety professionals, and which, got better over time. But I remember clearly the first time I knew that maybe I had made a mistake was when they were throwing rocks at me in the porta-john. They'd wait till I went on the porta-john and they would throw rocks at it, which if you've ever been in a porta-john, when it's getting hit with rocks, it'll shock you a little bit. And then it
Get your attention.
Yeah, it did. And then it escalated into they removed the lock, so I couldn't lock the door. So I had to learn how to hold the door shut with one hand and hold my radio up with the other. But that showed the difference, I think, that we're seeing now, is that safety was a police action, or considered to be. We were the catch you doing something wrong guys.
Oh, yeah.
Which I never understood and did not fully support. I left there, stayed with a large general contractor for 13 years. And then again, like you, we ended up together, working together. I worked for you, and then we worked as counterparts in the insurance industry before we started ProSafe. So why don't you talk a little bit about what safety was like at in the nuclear side?
Well, speaking of enforcement, that's what I learned. When I first went into the nuclear industry with Georgia Power Company, we were essentially safety cops. And there was no doubt about it. I mean, that's how that thing was set up. And so, we basically walked the job site. We caught people doing things wrong. We wrote them up, or we actually had the power to have them terminated. And, I know you've heard me tell the story before of marching 12 electricians to the gate who were up on a scaffold with no fall protection. And so we marched them all 12 to the gate, took their badges, locked them out of the job site, and they were banned for life from ever coming back to the job site. And back in those days, we had no idea that some of that stuff just might be system induced, or that there are other reasons why maybe they weren't in compliance. But we were pretty brutal, to be quite honest with you, and gave no second thought about people and their careers and some of the underlying reasons why they're doing what they're doing.
And I had to learn to be tough like that. Obviously, I started in safety at a time which there were literally no women in the industry, not for many, many years that I was in construction. But I was never wanting to be the one to fire people. Probably just the nursing background had a lot to do with it. I never felt like that should be my position. So the change in that has been, was very welcome to me, because I always saw that it was a problem. But, people say, well, you worked in the nuclear industry, so you saw this high level safety. It was high level safety for the time.
Compared to other areas of construction, yeah.
That's right. But it was terrible. I think about just PPE, safety glasses back in the day were not worn routinely like they are now. And they were terrible. They were the mono goggles for a long time. And there was tremendous non-compliance. Nobody wanted to wear them. And as a nurse, I spent a good portion of my day work day shift with another nurse, and we would go from table to table, numbing eyes and taking out foreign bodies. That was quite a learning experience for me. We were really lucky because we worked under standing orders and of a physician. We were able to do a lot of things that I don't see that's traditionally done today. But that was a big part of the day. So you would spend all day long taking foreign bodies out of eyes, where you could, waiting to hear the man down call. Yeah. And you remember that Gaytronic system, the loudspeaker that, no cell phones, of course. So you had the loudspeakers going continuously, but you quickly learned to filter all that noise out and hear that man down and respond to that. And of course, fall protection was safety belts, sort of, kind of.
Yeah,
Right?
sort of, kind of. Kind of getting back to the safety glasses. Do you remember those original ones? They were called OUs, and
Yes,
people
I
refer
do.
to them as old ugly because they made you. For guys, it made you look like Clark Kent, right? And
Right.
nobody wanted to wear them. They were
No.
uncomfortable. They hurt your ears. They pinched your nose. Nobody wanted to wear those things, but yet, because that was, the rule. In fact, I remember we got accused one time of Gestapo tactics. I'll never forget the time that we had about 30 safety people lined up on each side of the gate, catching people, because the rule was when you walk in that gate, you got on a hard hat, you got on your safety glasses, your boots, all of that stuff. And so that was our job, to catch them and then either terminate their employment or to write them up. And which, by the way, that whole thing about terminating people's employment, that was a pretty doggone routine thing. And we had the authority to do that. But that's just the way you did things back in those days.
Yeah, and it was also a violent time. And it stayed violent, I would say, up until maybe the early 90s. It started to get better. When I was at Hanford, at one point, my grandfather, my father, and an uncle of mine were all working out on the site. And my father, and I would, listen to the man down calls and think, which building is that? And could it be, one of my family members? But my grandfather was a general superintendent, and he fired a traveling pipe fitter one point in time and made the mistake of turning his back after he fired him. And the guy came up behind him and hit him and knocked him down to the mezzanine grating, and probably would have killed him had not some of his men came and intervened. I dealt with threats of violence all the time. When I left nuclear construction and went to commercial construction starting in Texas, I quickly learned that I had to carry a gun. Now I know, everyone says, "Oh, you can't have guns on job sites." Well,
Not back in those days.
I had a gun. Not only in Atlanta in the 80s, downtown was really terrifying. I don't know if people realize how scary it was, and especially after hours. And I mean, I needed to have my gun in my hand in my pocket to walk from the parking lot to the job site, and then it went in my boot on the job site. Had a lot of threats of violence, some big, some small. You remember some of those, don't you?
Oh yeah, working in dangerous areas like that, you pretty much had to do that. But kind of getting back to what we were talking about earlier, the fact that people did not like safety people, a lot of it just had to do with the approach itself.
Yes.
And just to give you an example, getting back to that whole thing about the constant enforcement stuff, I remember the days on the Vogtle nuclear project of getting a crane suspended personnel platform, or as most people in construction call it, a man basket.
Man basket.
With a couple of other safety people, and we would have the tower crane lift us up and fly us around the job looking for people either not tied off, or that were not wearing their PPE, or they were doing something on the scaffold without guardrails. And we would land down right next to them and say, "Give me your badge," and then head to the gate. Or we would have, we would have these little write-up slips we would give them. And but that was kind of routine. In fact, I tell you, I remember when I almost transitioned at the end of Vogtle over to Georgia Power Corporate, and they had a whole different approach, and they were more of the view of being resources and advisors and consultants. rather than safety cops. And when I first heard that, I thought these people are completely off base. Looking back on it these days, that's exactly where we should have been. But, it's just the way things were handled in large, heavy construction back in those days.
Well, ironically, it was quite a while after that when I first met you, when we were working for Argonaut, who was probably one of the most advanced insurance carriers in workers' comp at the time.
Yeah.
And was all about accountability and where it needed to lie and all that. When I heard that, it was like, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. What we're doing is wrong and it doesn't work. You mentioned the man basket. I have to tell my first ride in a man basket was as a nurse. And it was probably the first week that I was there. And they put me and the head nurse I was working with at the time in a man basket in the reactor building and took us up to the top. And the operator took that man basket and started slamming it up against the sides of the building while we were in there. And I remember her screaming and me going, oh my God, they're going to kill us, but that was that horseplay thing that happened. That was pretty common then. And you had to be able to show that you were tough. In fact, they took us up top and got out where they were erecting steel, and we're standing there right on the decking before walked out on the steel, and they're all out on the steel, all the way at the top of the reactor dome, no fall protection. And they said, "Are you guys got the guts to come out here and get us?" And I remember Sam was the lady I was working with, Pam and Sam, and she said, you get hurt, we'll be out there. And they were both satisfied with that. And after that, that's when we, had this really great relationship with the guys out there that, yeah, okay, they'll come take care of us. But that was my first ride in a man basket. The threats of violence thing, it makes me think about when I was on a job in downtown Atlanta. We had some conflict going on with an out-of-state steel erector who came to town and wasn't the hometown favorite, and there was a lot of violence going on. In fact, the owner of that steel erector, who was out of Texas, got jumped by two iron workers in downtown Atlanta in broad daylight and almost killed on the streets, just headed to the bank. And I went out one day and there was an iron worker who was literally falling down drunk at 7:30 in the morning, literally. And I looked at the superintendent for the GCE that I worked with and the supervisor of the steel erector. And I was like, well, I guess what you got to do, is get him out of here. So the word went around that I had fired the iron worker, and I didn't do like you. I didn't march people to the gate, but in this case, I said he's got to go. So they decided that I had to go, and I was in the office about a block away from the job when we got a call on the radio that there were iron workers on their way to get me.
Yeah,
basically. And we were down in a basement of a building there. And I got the call and they told me go out the back door, and I could hear spud wrenches clanking coming down the stairs as I ran out the back door. And one of my coworkers brought my car around for me so I could get out of there. But that continued for the whole length of that job, that fear of violence. And it was
there was a lot of violence. There was a lot of animosity against safety people. I'll tell you, I remember one time on that Vogel project climbing a 300-foot stair tower going up a cooling tower, and thought it was raining, but the sky was clear.
It wasn't raining.
That was not rain.
It wasn't raining.
People did not like safety people back in those days. That was definitely not rain.
that same job that I was just talking about, I got a bucket of, hopefully it was just dirty water, but I don't know, dumped on me from overhead and it just completely drenched me.
Yeah.
And I had to go home and change clothes and all of that. But it wasn't just safety people. I remember a knifing in a job trailer downtown Atlanta where I heard on the radio that the general superintendent was firing 2 of our employees for fighting on the job. So, he didn't deal with it himself. He sent them to the trailer to get their checks. And so I'm thinking, oh my gosh, they're going to go to that trailer where the girls, where the women are, and so what am I doing? I'm going to go over there and make sure they're okay. And one of the young office engineers walked in the trailer and as they came in to get their checks, they started fighting again, and he jumped in the middle of them. And I was like, don't do that, man. Don't do that. Get out of there, And pretty soon there's blood. And one of them had knifed the other. And that young engineer was lucky that he was just a very short distance away from getting knifed himself. But that was not unusual.
No, I mean, there was a lot of violence. I remember one time we had a crane operator who was messing with these iron workers. And the iron workers had been giving him a hard time. And he picked up a porta-john and raised it over their head and shook it. And of course, the result of that, well, they came down off the steel and jerked him out of the cab of that crane. And they beat the fool out of that guy.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you remember fights. I mean, fights happen on job sites fairly frequently.
I remember when there was this move back and forth as to whether companies could have both union, non-union workers on them. And so there's a lot of fighting between the rod busters and the iron workers. The rod busters were non-union at that time, and the iron workers were union. And they would wait till a rod buster was bent down tying steel next to a beam, and then they would hit the beam with a sledgehammer on the floor above, and it would just causing. So they did that one time to this one rod buster, nice guy, but he was big, muscular guy, and he just ran up and grabbed that iron worker and beat the stuffing out of him. And so, the rule was that you were fired for that. And so, what they did is they called up the rod buster company and said, hey, your guy here, got in a fight, but can you just put him on another job? Because, wasn't his fault, really. And so they went to put him on another job. And I remember the general superintendent, as the guy was leaving, went out and had gone and bought him a case of beer and gave him the case of beer and shook his hand and said, I appreciate you beating the crap out of that guy. That was and speaking of alcohol and drugs, oh my goodness.
Bunch of that.
Oh my goodness.
Remember the topping out parties?
Well, yeah. And I dreaded those because
for the people that we may have some non-construction people listening to this. So explain what a topping out party is for those that might not know.
So when you got to the top of a multi-story building, they would put the tree up there to signify that they had reached the top, structurally with it. And then there would be this big bash, and there would be beer kegs and bottles of liquor and prostitutes in some cases. I mean, it was insane.
Yep.
And so I would do my best to make a quick appearance and hand out T-shirts and leave before things got out of hand. Marijuana, my goodness, you could smell it everywhere.
Yep.
I mean, it was all over the job, which you and I remember a contractor when we went to drug testing. You want to talk about that? Who didn't think too much of the idea of drug testing?
Yeah, that was actually in the 90s. This is pretty good time past those Vogel days. But this was a contractor that put panels on the side of high rises. And so it's extremely dangerous work. And we were in the insurance industry at the time. And I remember having some conversations with the president and vice president of the company about doing drug testing. And they were okay with it, with the exception they wanted to exempt marijuana. And I said, no, you can't do that. And why would you even want to do that? And they said, because we smoke it ourselves. We don't
see a
anything
problem with it.
But that was the mentality back in those days. I'll tell you another one. We had, I'll never forget back in the Vogel days, we actually had a tower crane operator who was standing about 2 sections down on the tower, screaming and waving his arms. It turned out the guy was on PCP. And he was going to jump off of that tower. And so we had to send another crane operator up around him and get up in the cab and drop the hook down. And we had some security guards that came, and we put them into a man basket and had to fly them up there. And they had to restrain this guy and get him in that basket and get him down. But I mean, that kind of stuff was fairly routine.
Yeah, my first day, I got transferred to New Orleans, which, boy, that was a culture shock, to do a job. And at first, that when I walked up to the job, there were iron workers and other folks all sitting on the curb drinking beer. I'd flown in that day, and it was break time, and they're drinking beer, and I'm like, ooh, this is not good. And then who was going to be my supervisor, the regional guy, met me there, and I said something to him about what is up with the tower crane operators operating very erratically. And he said, I don't know, but I'm going to find out. And he went up, climbed the end of the tower crane, and found a bottle of port wine sitting out on the boom, just keeping it nice and cool. He was drunk as a skunk. So got through that. And then, I went to meet the project manager in his office, and I said, pleasantries. And then I said, look, there's down at break time, they're all down there drinking just right in front of the job, sitting on the curb down there. And he looked at me and he said, well, lady, you can't tell them what they can do on their break. And then he opened the cabinet behind him that was full of liquor and said, let's have a drink, talk about it. Right. So I know, like, boy, you're in a whole new culture here. Oh, you talked about the crane operator on PCP. I witnessed a death. Was on a job in New Orleans, and right across the canal street from us was another project going on. And we're on the top of our building, looking over the top of that building, and we see a guy who's screaming and hollering, and we're like, what's going on over there? And we're watching, and pretty soon he takes off from one side of the building to the other, running full tilt, screaming the whole way, and then dove over the rail head first into a dumpster down below. I mean, dead as a doornail, killed him, right? And he was high on PCP. So that was quite a.
And the horseplay, I mean, you mentioned that a little bit a while ago. I mean, there was just so much horseplay on job sites.
Yeah.
And just ridiculous things that went on. For example, one of the common things that welders used to do is fill a balloon full of acetylene.
Oh, yes.
And just about the time a guy struck an arc, they would throw it down there and it would explode.
Yes.
And of course, we actually had some injuries from that. They thought that was really funny. I mean, there were lots of things that went on like that. Just
putting rubber snakes in people's lunch buckets.
Yeah,
that was a common one.
I remember one time we had some electricians that had a shack, their brake shack, and it was made out of metal and it was covered with tarps and that sort of thing. But a cat kept coming in and stealing lunch. And so they electrified the shack to try to electrocute the cat.
That's terrible.
Of course, they never got the cat, but they risked themselves being electrocuted or somebody else grabbing the door of the thing and being electrocuted. I mean, there were crazy things that went on back in those days.
So I'm going to go ahead and admit to having done something that today I would never do, obviously, and never recommend. But we were doing a job in downtown Atlanta where we added 7 floors to a pretty known building here, and we had to do it all at night. And we were having problems. This is in the 80s, and crime was so terrible that we were all parking right around the base of the building and trying to keep an eye on our cars, but it didn't matter. They kept at night, these people would come through and they would get into our cars. If you locked it, they'd take a baseball bat and they'd just bust your windows out and steal your stuff. And so it was becoming really a bad situation. And the iron workers were outraged and there was going to be some violence. And so I called the police several times and never got any response. And so someone on the job said, well, you want to talk to the cops, go down to the Greyhound bus station because that's where they go and drink coffee at night. So I'm like, all right. So I go down to the Greyhound bus station at night, in this terrible crime-ridden town, and found him. And I went up to him and explained, I said, listen, we have got this terrible problem. And could you guys just, come and make some routine trips around the building and try to help us out? And they basically looked at me and go, no, we're not doing that, And so I was getting frustrated. So I said, well, look, if you don't do that, one of these iron workers is going to kill somebody. And guy cop spun around and looked at me and said, then call us. So I'm like, my God, what are we going to do? So we had a balcony on that building where we could see over, but they couldn't see us from the street. So I got some M80s from Alabama. And we would watch these guys come with their baseball bats to bust into the cars, and I'd light one and toss it over the side. It only took a couple of those, and of course, no one injured, but scared them off pretty good, and they quit breaking into our cars.
That would work, right?
Yeah, but certainly not something you would expect people to do today, right?
No, I tell you, just a complete, people today, and I guess that's one of the reasons we're kind of doing that is, we got so many new people coming into safety these days, and, things have changed so much. Theft was another thing. Theft was pretty rampant. I remember even in the 80s, when I was in bridge and highway construction on the downtown connector project in Atlanta, we would have routinely bulldozers being stolen, graders being stolen. And we'd come in on Monday morning and here's a,
no equipment.
Yeah, here's a $200,000 piece of equipment completely gone. And what would happen is that people would come out there on the weekend and they would put on a hard hat and a vest, and they would have a lowboy trailer, and they would start the bulldozer up, pull it up on that trailer. And then we find out they were taking those things down to Savannah and putting them on ships and sending them overseas.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, it was just crazy. That was the larger type of theft, but smaller theft was just rampant as well.
Well, and it wasn't just the big stuff either. You talked about the guys put on a hard hat and it wasn't a vest. They weren't vests then. Remember that?
Right.
When did that start? 2000 sometime. But somebody just put a hard hat on and walked. Job sites in downtown Atlanta were wide open. Anybody could walk onto a job site. So they hard hat on and walk on the job, and they'd go, look,
no
somebody
security.
would be working with a tool and just turn around, and that guy'd snatch that up and go.
That's the thing is that, people today, they see all this security on job sites. We got fencing, and sometimes you got, you have to check in to even get in the job site. But back in those days, there was none of that. We had even in the up in the 90s. You remember all the times that we had people climbing tower cranes.
Yes.
I remember one time one of the activist groups climbed a tower crane up in North Atlanta and was hanging the activist banners off of that.
Well, yeah, that was the Home Depot headquarters.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's exactly
Home Depot
right.
headquarters building, and they were mad about where Home Depot was getting their wood from and so forth. We had one in the company I work for in Miami where the guy broke in at night, and whatever happened, he fell from the tower crane and died. And there was, of course, litigation that we dealt with after that. Same thing in New Orleans during Mardi Gras. We had fencing that would get broken down, and we had one sexual assault that happened in our building that we ended up with litigation about, and a suicide on the job. And, you know, we would have fencing, but what we quickly learned is you had to go out there and take pictures of that fencing to prove that it was up, because it'd get torn down during Mardi Gras. It was a crazy time. You know, we talked about today, and you and I have talked about this a lot, that there's a lot of safety people today that have never seen a bad accident.
That's right. And that was pretty routine in our days to see very devastating accidents.
Horrific accidents. You know, there were the one that I will never forget, and it was a guy who was cutting this large pipe bracing. And, you know, short version of the story is that there was still tension on the pipe and he didn't know it. And he was actually an apprentice. And the ironworker that was cutting it had been cutting standing to the side, but apprentice kept begging he wanted to cut. So the ironworker said, well, yeah, go ahead. I'm gonna go get some coffee. And he squatted on the pipe for those last couple of inches, and it came up and took the top of his skull off, basically. Yeah. And he was still alive. I remember him. I remember his name. I remember going down to the basement. He was laying in face down in a puddle of water, and I turned him over, and I was sure he was dead from the look at him, but I called his name and said something. He started to breathe. We had to get a man basket, get him out of there and all that sort of thing. He coded when he got to the top out of the basement. They got him back. They took him got him to the hospital. They said he'd never live 24 hours. He lived, but he was a young iron worker with children, and he had destroyed the part of his brain that manages emotions. So he had no control. He'd go from rage to happiness to crying to back and forth. And I've never forgotten him and what happened to him.
Just so much stuff like that. You know, I actually had a friend of mine who was killed on the Vogel project, which, by the way, back in those days, we were under a voluntary protection program for OSHA.
Yeah.
In fact, Vogel was the first nuclear construction site in the nation to receive the OSHA Star Award. But we had 8 fatalities on that job site.
Right.
And, you know,
oh, yeah.
Yeah. And that was considered exemplary safety back in those days. And
that's
we
right.
were having 8 fatalities. And one of them was a friend of mine who fell down an elevator shaft in the turbine building. And I'll never forget that day of getting the call. We had a man down in an elevator shaft, and I was the first one down there. And I noticed a yellow Georgia Power hard hat laying over to the side. And that's what our construction coordinators wore. And turned out he's a friend of mine that, and in fact, turned out that the head of safety for construction for Georgia Power at the time, that was actually his son-in-law. And I had to call him and report that. And when I told him his name, he just went into shock. But you know, a lot of people today have not seen some of these horrific injuries. You know, I remember the days of having, you know, this sounds pretty gross, but having somebody's brains and blood splattered all over your clothes.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I remember that with the ironworker I was telling you about, that the press was immediately there, and I had his blood and brains all down my jeans. And I'm like, oh my God, the press is coming. And I had to step in a porta-john. I was trying to clean that off of my clothing before the press got there. The other problem with that is, of course, anyone with a spark of humanity is going to be torn up about those terrible accidents. But what even compounded it is that it was our fault. It literally was perceived to be our fault. It was the failure of the safety staff.
Yeah.
When something like that happened. That's
a big change. You know, today, most people, at least any company that's even fairly sophisticated in safety, knows that the job of safety is to be an advisor and a resource and a consultant. They're not the people responsible for safety, but safety people were blamed back in those days for accidents.
Well, I still see a lot of that when you have folks with a misguided overemphasis, which is still so rampant out there on recordable incident rates, and safety people feel under pressure to not record or those kind of things because somehow it reflects upon them. It does not reflect upon them.
Right.
I almost lost my job the first 3 months that I was in safety because of something like that out at Hanford, where there was a situation where there was, I was over the turbine generator building, and there was a crane operation going on outside, and there was an oiler that would, during crane operations, would get back there and be oiling and doing stuff, which he wasn't supposed to be doing, obviously.
An oiler is somebody that greases the crane.
Right. And so it was, I don't want to say the general contractor, but it was not who I worked for, but the kind of like the Georgia Power folks. And I reported it on 2 occasions to who needed to deal with it. And fortunately, when I had started, there was a safety management guy who had told me, basically told me, said, you'll never cut it. This ain't gonna work out. But at least do this, get a notebook and write down everything that happens during the day, and keep that notebook in your truck, not in the office. And I had. And so what happened was that oiler kept doing what he was doing, and he had that rag, and it got sucked into the gears of the crane, and it took off all the fingers on his right hand. And so I'm out there dealing. I was actually out there looking for his thumb, which I found, so they could reattach it, when I got called to the head of Hanford Construction's office. Said, you got to go in there and talk to him. And my boss showed up, and he comes in with me. And so the still remember the gentleman's name. And he said, he looked at my boss and he said, give me one reason why she's not fired over this. And so he starts kind of stuttering, and I'm looking like he's like backing up towards the door. And I'm like, what the heck, and I said, listen, I did report this. And he goes, BS. And I said, I have a diary. He said, all right, go get it. So I ran out and got to my truck and came back in. I showed him in the diary where I had reported it and who I'd reported it to. And at the time I was wearing one of the since I've got pipe fitter father and grandfather, etc., I've got this beautiful turquoise inlaid belt buckle. And he said, I'll tell you what, give me that belt buckle and we'll just call it good. Pulled my belt off, took that belt buckle and put it down on his desk and walked out. And I never forgot that, though. And I know it's changed to some degree, but I still feel that it is, if a safety person is in a situation in which management actually tries to hold them responsible for things they don't have control over, that they should do exactly what I did. And that is keep track of these conversations.
Yeah, because unfortunately, that's still to some degree, not as much as it used to, but to some degree, it does still happen today. I remember even in our insurance days, a president of a large industrial contractor came to Atlanta and was raising Cain about the fact he was getting medical bills and the insurance company was not paying them. And it turns out our claims people had never even gotten the claims.
Right.
And it turned out that the reason they had not gotten the claims is they had never been filed, right, because the safety director of that company was being held accountable for the insurance experience modification rate, which is really based on the frequency of claims. And so he was hiding the claims reports in his desk. Yep. And the president of the company found all, and of course the guy was terminated for that. But that whole thing of how you hold people accountable, what you hold them accountable for, makes a really big difference. And unfortunately, the safety people too often took the fall for problems.
And some of them are willing to take the credit for good results, which I don't believe that you deserve credit or blame. Myself, right. You're part of a team, right? And so I know you remember this. where I had a large contractor here in Atlanta who they had some real issues with their safety person, and they let them go. And the CEO called me up and he said, listen, you want to just stop by my office and let's just kick around, going to be hiring this new person. I want to talk about how we're going to set that up and everything. So I was like, sure. So I came in and he said, first of all, I want to talk about how we're going to hold this person, the new safety person, accountable for safety performance. And I said, well, you're not. And so we got, he didn't like that answer at all. And it got into somewhat of a heated conversation. He said, well, I'm accountable for financial results. Why shouldn't he be responsible for safety results? And I said, okay, I'll tell you what, I'll compromise with you on this. If you will put it in writing that he has hire and fire authority with your division vice presidents. In other words, if they're not performing in safety, he can fire them. Then I'll agree that he can be accountable for that. And he said, you're just crazy. And basically, I never spoke to the man again. That was ended that conversation. And he went forward with that. That's still a problem. If you can't make leadership changes, how could you be accountable for safety performance?
Absolutely.
And
you know that was a pretty common. In fact, it still exists in some companies today.
Well, you mentioned this earlier. I think it's important to repeat. What is the role of a safety person, Mike?
Right. It's to be a resource. It's to be an advisor. It's to be a consultant.
Yes.
And it's to be a measurer of safety performance.
Yes.
In other words, measuring how well operations is managing their safety process, because It is their process, not the safety department's.
Exactly.
You mentioned something a few minutes ago that's kind of interesting about the belt buckle. And, that was another thing that's pretty common back, especially back in the nuclear days, and especially with those pipe fitters, is it was pretty common to walk down a hallway and see sort of a monitor out there looking down the hallway, looking for a supervisor or a manager.
Oh, yeah.
And back in one of the back rooms, you'd have 2 or 3 pipe fitters back there making belt buckles out of stainless steel pipe.
That's right.
I mean, they made great belt buckles. They put bullets in on turquoise. I mean, they made great things. They made cookers to cook food, which, in the nuclear industry, that's that's a violation of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to cook food in a nuclear power plant. But they were pretty good at it.
They were.
I'll never forget one day walking through the turbine building and smelling barbecue. Mm-hmm. And we looked for about 2 hours trying to find that. We finally found it. Turned out some pipe fitters had taken a gang box, a big toolbox, mm-hmm. and had lined it with preheat blankets that you preheat pipes with before welding. And they had a rotisserie in there. And they had chickens and ribs turning, cooking that stuff. And I mean, it was just, those were some wild days. The other thing about the safety award thing is not only back in those days in the 80s, but even sometimes in the 90s, safety awards became bartering items. Yes. That a lot of things got done by bartering, by doing favors. And I'll never forget one time back on that Vogel nuclear project, I was on a weekend shift one time and wanted a pickup truck because I was having to walk everywhere I went. And so the head guy said, we will let you use a pickup truck that belongs to one of the big contractors out there. But he very specifically said, you better not get one scratch on that truck. If you get one scratch on that truck, you'll never get another truck again. I hadn't had that truck 2 hours. And I'm out with one of the ironworker safety people, and a wasp flies in the window, and he takes a magazine and he hits the windshield and busts the windshield. So we go to the mechanic shop and hoping they just replace that windshield for us as a favor, right? So the guy at the mechanic shop kind of leans back and says, "What's it worth to you?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, I need some stuff. So I said, "What do you need?" He said, "Well, I need one of those Georgia Power hats that you guys have." And those were a special award that we had that were only for the safety people. There were only a few of them. And all I had was just the one that I had at home. And I said, "I don't have one." He goes, "Well, then you're not getting a windshield." And so ultimately I had to bring my hat in the next day and give him my hat to get a windshield in that truck. but that's the way things went back in those days.
Well, and then there was a dark side to that too. There was folks that would offer safety people things
Oh yeah,
to look the other way.
pay them off. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, fortunately, I don't think we ever fell into that trap. But I'll tell you that I know a lot of people that did.
Yes, absolutely. I was warned about that, especially when I got to New Orleans. I remember a sub, I got introduced to them and they said, hey, we'll take you to lunch. We'll take you here in the quarter and buy a good lunch. And said, okay, we'll catch up. And the person I was with said, let me just tell you something right now. There'll be a price for that lunch.
Yeah.
So you probably don't want to do it. Well, I think we've talked a lot about how it was.
And that's not to mention some of the things you briefly did mention, safety belts, and that was pretty common. I mean, up until OSHA actually required harnesses, safety belts were the thing that we did. We thought we were actually doing a good thing. And didn't realize the dangers of just putting someone in a belt, but that's how you did fall protection back in those days.
The other issue that's changed dramatically is, of course, silica.
Yeah.
And it's ironic how long it's taken. I remember, especially in commercial construction, as a nurse, right? A background in nursing. And I remember, learning about asbestos and some of the other health related things, but I must have not been there that day on silica, but it was clear to me that the situation we saw in commercial construction where these guys would be chipping concrete all day long and completely covered, they look like they've been dumped in flour at the end of the day. I'm like, that can't be good. We got to do something about that. And, one of the early proponents on, we've got to use water for that. But it was, I'd say around 1990 or so, when you and I were first working together, was that 91, 92, that one of our coworkers tipped me off to read the book by Michael Cherniak about Hawks Nest Tunnel and what all happened there. And that opened my eyes to the whole silica issue. And so that became more and more common that we were proposing water, but we didn't have the tools. We didn't have the ventilated tools.
But I remember back in, the 70s, the 80s, and even some of the early 90s there. I mean, from my perspective, silica was just not even on my radar. It's just one of those things that I really didn't even realize it was a big deal until OSHA started making a big deal of it. And, and in fact, that and other things, even respirators, back in those days, we just put people in respirators. I mean, we might give an organic filter respirator or non-organic or a dust filter. We might give them a respirator, but actually doing fit testing was hardly ever done.
Well, I got a secret to tell you. I'm not sure it's happening today, except for the bigger contractors. There's still quite a bit of that, but you're right. It's surprising. I like to ask people if I'm teaching a class on silica, when did you first hear about this? And most people say, 2017, when the standard came out. I didn't have any idea before that. And that's it's a shocking and sad testimony to our focus has been on the more visible physical safety hazards and not understanding the health related hazards. And I would say that I think that the last frontier for us in safety is welding. And that's one that we have not dealt with. And it's pretty shocking, probably the amount of serious health impacts that happen to our welders because we don't deal with ventilation for that.
Even confined space entry. We in nuclear construction, we had pretty advanced confined space program at that time, which was almost non-existent out in the commercial arena at that time.
No.
And it started coming along. But you remember getting a comment from a gentleman back in, I don't know, it was probably the late 90s about how to retrieve somebody out of confined space. Want to tell about that?
Well, yeah, you're being nicer about it, but I was doing oversight for an owner, and don't want to say what project, and this electrical contractor had their guys working in confined spaces with a rope tied to them, and that was it. And I called up the corporate safety guy, and I'm like, you don't have a mechanical means of rescue for these guys. You need a way to get them out. And he got pretty agitated and said, I got a blankety blank rope and I got a blankety blank backhoe and I'll get them out. And my comment was, yeah, but in how many pieces?
Yeah.
So that was big contractor here in Atlanta.
But before we move on to the way things are, I mean, you have to also account for the fact that training was pretty minimal back in those days. I remember, when I first went to work in safety, my training was walking around with an old gentleman that had been in construction for about 40 years and him showing me things. I didn't get any formal training in safety. I was a paramedic when I went to work for Georgia Power Company. There was no training. It was walking around with this gentleman saying, look for this and look for that. And then ultimately, I do remember a few years later, and this is back before you had OSHA 10 and 30-hour courses and 500 courses and all that stuff. There were two guys from the OSHA Training Institute in Chicago who came down and did a thing called an OSHA 200 course. And that today would be sort of like a 510. It was a standards course. And it was about a 4-day course or something. But that's the first time I ever got any formal training in what the standards actually said.
Well, see, I never got that. What I got was a copy that government issued 1926 standards. Remember that book?
Yeah.
Remember
Yeah.
the print?
The one that was so difficult to find everything in.
And you couldn't find anything.
No index.
And no idea. And one of the best resources, and I'm not naming by name, that I had back in the day was a guy named Steve Hayes.
Yeah.
And when they started the OSHA Training Institute, Georgia Tech being one of the first four, is that correct, Mike?
Yeah.
1990? What year was that?
Yeah, I think it was 1990. Yeah.
1990. Steve was heading that up, and he'd come from a contractor here in Atlanta, and he was a great guy. And I could call him and just ask him, Steve, can you help me out? And that relationship grew, and then you and I knew Steve, and he, when they started the first 500s, 510s, both you and I were guest instructors.
Yeah.
I came and did concrete, and I can't remember what you did back then. I had concrete and demo, and
yeah, I did some cranes and electrical, those sort of
cranes, and stuff like that. And then, of course, when Steve got ready to move on to other opportunity, that's when he called you up.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah. Steve was moving on into private industry and had recommended me to Georgia Tech to take his place. And at that time, we had just started our company, ProSafe. And so I explained that I'm not really interested in being an employee, but I would be willing to do that under an agreement. And so that's sort of how that developed. And it just kind of grew from there. And then, of course, you and Philip shortly thereafter came in, and we sort of split all of that up. And, and of course, I've pulled out of a lot of the regulatory stuff today, but you and Philip are still very active in that. But that's kind of where all that started.
Well, Philip's pretty much heading all that up, and I'm just helping here and there. But that was it was a great opportunity for us at ProSafe, and it was a learning experience. You and I steal this and say it all the time myself, but the axiom, see one, do one, teach one.
Yeah.
And so we had seen it and we had done it, but when you have to teach it, you really learn it.
You dig in.
You do. And then, of course, you have all the challenges to that, which that was always the dreaded class. I think Philip still dreads that class from time to time, was the 502.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the high level tough group.
That's the folks that have been trainers, they've been in safety a long time, and you try to tell them something and they challenge you, and well, you better be right.
But you got a good point about the more that you do it, the more that you practice it, the more that you take the feedback from the evaluations, the more that you seek to continuously improve, the better that you get. And, honestly, you rarely get any kind of positive feedback. But I do remember one time a guy walking up to me at a break and said, you guys, do you realize how many people you've probably impacted over the years?
Yeah.
And I said, what do you mean? He goes, how many safety people do you think that you have probably trained over the years? And I said, well, I've never really thought about that. But it turns out, it was probably thousands. One time we were the only ed center in the whole Southeast.
Right.
And then over the years subsequent to that, and he goes, the fact that you guys have trained all of these people and they've gone out and trained other people, that the number of lives that you've impacted is enormous. And I said, I've just never really thought about it like that. But, that's the one thing that's always stuck in my head, was that positive comment from that guy.
But on training, like you said, training was non-existent. So the OSHA Training Institute has tremendously changed that.
Yes.
But that evolution is still happening. And, we started with just regulatory training. That was the main thing. And we started with regulatory check the box.
Yeah.
Right. Check the box, they were trained. Now obviously the right focus, the focus is that you actually know that you train and educate, right? And that includes, skill assessments and knowing that they actually comprehended and they came away knowing things. The model for training today is, confined space is my favorite example for this, and is that, you do some classroom training. And in fact, I was doing a class one time just a few years ago here in Atlanta, and we had I had a vendor with me, which I always encourage. You bring in your vendor with your monitor and so forth, and let them do some specific manufacturer training. So he did some training and talking up front, and then he took the monitor and he tossed it to somebody in the classroom, and he said, okay, turn it on. And the guy just stared at it. He had just gone through exactly how to operate it, the buttons to push and all that, and he couldn't do it. And that just reinforced to me, you actually have to do it. So then he kind of laughed and he said, push the button, okay, and walked him through. And then, we went out and everyone had to actually put their hands on it and demonstrate their ability to use it and demonstrate their ability to calibrate it and practice with a blower and all of those things. That is the way that training needs to be. We've got to move away from the check the box training.
Yeah, and a lot of the more advanced folks have done that, but there's still many companies out there that they simply just want a piece of paper to say that people have been trained.
Right.
They could care less about the quality of the training, and they just want a piece of paper in case they get inspected by OSHA to say that we trained our people.
What frustrates me though too is this training as punishment.
Yeah.
And OSHA, is not helped with this.
Right. They have lots of standards that say people have to be retrained if they're in violation of the standard, which oftentimes, as we know today, that sometimes that's induced by the operating system itself. It's not necessarily the worker.
Exactly. We know that people sit through a training class, depending upon how good that class is, they get a little bit of information. They don't get it all. And then they go out in the field and now it's the real world. And I've heard, and I know you've heard people say in the field, well, that's what you heard in class, this is what we're doing out here.
Yeah.
And if nobody's doing that we talked about in the classroom, that worker's not going to be doing that. And that reflects the system and especially leadership. And so punishing the worker by saying, I've had this happen so many times. Somebody comes into a class and I'm like, hey, wait a minute, you've already been in this class. Yeah, but I got in trouble, so I got to come back.
Yeah.
Well, is he listening and paying attention that time? Of course he's not. And that's not what I want to see equated with training as punishment. We want training to be something that people actually enjoy and get something out of. I mean, it's there to keep them safe, to send them home safe.
One of the refreshing things is, we've been talking about how things were back in the day. And of course, things have changed and they've transitioned and they've improved. There's still some issues out there, but by and large, there's been many, many changes. And probably the most refreshing change to me is the movement toward advanced safety management and
Yes.
human performance. Moving more towards repositioning safety with operations, holding supervisors and managers accountable for safety rather than the safety people.
Yes.
Measuring the right kind of indicators to drive safety in the organization. The whole psychological aspects of performance coaching. And then, of course, the human performance aspects of understanding human error and how you respond to that. Because for so long, people were punished for errors that they honestly didn't have control over. So this whole new understanding of human error and how to deal with that is a big advancement. And we're seeing that change, a lot of the bigger companies, but there's still a lot of folks out there who've never even heard of this stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's just a tiny, 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 tiny sliver of construction that is at that point. The physical conditions on jobs has changed dramatically. Things as simple as good perimeter protection, rather than cruddy guardrails and broken guardrails and so forth. Housekeeping is enormously changed.
Yeah.
That's what's dramatic. I remember a job one time that literally you couldn't walk across the floor, and a superintendent telling me, look, lady, I've sold jobs with trash on them, housekeeping was just not the thing. And so those physical conditions are so much better, but the blame, shame, misunderstanding of the difference between errors and violations,
Yeah.
and how to manage that, understanding culpability, understanding the critical role that leadership plays, and number one, if a worker is doing at-risk behavior, why does he think that's okay?
Uh-huh.
Well, he obviously thinks that his immediate supervisor is okay with that.
Mhm.
And so there you go. There's your mirror, right? There's where your issue is. You can put 15 new workers under that same leadership and you'll get the same results if we're not dealing with that.
Because leadership creates the culture, and that culture has a major influence on the decisions workers make out there.
Absolutely.
So for the companies that are moving in that direction, I really applaud them. But things have changed. I agree with the physical changes. Even on the housekeeping thing, you've got companies today. Some companies that are even practicing lean construction, and they're
Yes.
implementing 5S and other lean type concepts for continuous improvement, which is dramatically different than job sites used to just be a pigsty.
Well, and I'm a huge proponent, as you know, of lean. There's a lot of ways it can go wrong. Probably the big one is, well, we're just going to do 5S.
Yeah.
No, well, safety's going to run this. No, it's not run. It's site leadership runs this. That's the way that has to work. But the beauty of it, when it's done well, is that you're striving for continuous improvement and the elimination of waste, and you're connecting safety waste and operational waste. We in safety get over focused on safety, and we don't talk about how if we change how we do this here with worker input and come up with a better way to do this, it's going to be safer, but it's also going to be more efficient. It's going to save us money and productivity and time.
A good example is that you just sent me an email the other day about a thing called a rigging rack study.
Right.
Where people put rigging on racks instead of just laying the slings and the chokers on the ground out there. And that study illustrated just how much time got wasted trying to find the rigging and how much money was saved. And over a period of time, it was pretty dramatic, the thousands of dollars that were saved just simply having a rack out there.
I completely am mystified how leadership on a job would not understand that leaving something as expensive as a piece of rigging in the mud makes sense financially. Is take the safety regulation out of things here and just look at, does that make sense? And so, and that's tied to that whole 5S process of perfecting our systems and eliminating waste, and hunting for tools, hunting for equipment, hunting for rigging is pure waste. Yeah. And you end up people using a piece of rigging or a tool that's unsafe at the same time.
Yeah, it drives shortcuts.
Exactly.
We've talked about a lot of stuff here, Pam, and I know that we've kind of covered a lot about the way things used to be back in the day. Thank goodness a lot of that stuff has changed. Still a lot of stuff that needs to change, but anything else you feel that would be something that would be valuable for folks to hear?
No, I just kind of have to laugh that, when I was young, I used to hang out with my father, grandfather, and uncles, all who were in construction. I would listen. I would sit at the table and listen as they played poker and talked construction stories. And I remember listening to those stories, and I remember those stories. And now I realize I'm old and I'm telling stories too. But we learn from those stories, and we learn how to change and how to be better from that.
But I do think it's helpful for especially younger people getting into safety today, and especially construction safety, to have some context of where things have come.
Yes.
It's easy for somebody to come into the workforce today and see all the modern safety technology we have and all the great training and all the things that go on in safety today, and kind of think, well, that's the way everything's always been. It's not. There has been a massive evolution. And so sometimes I just think it's helpful for people to have some kind of a historical context of the evolution of things.
And then we will save to another podcast a talk about where we're going.
Yeah, and that'll be a good one.
And that's going to be a good one.
Hope everybody enjoyed this, and we'll see you on the next one down the road. Thank you, Pam. That was great.
Appreciate it.